A warm welcome to everyone at the, I think, 36th edition of Europe Calling. Europe Calling is a series of webinars to get people in touch all over Europe with people who have a say in European politics, have great ideas about what Europe could do. And this time, I'm particularly honored to have two esteemed people here as guests. First, Professor Gabriel Zucman, you tell us afterwards how to pronounce that properly. So he's a French of origin and a professor of economics at the University of Berkeley. And he has recently written a book of which I'm a great fan, The Triumph of Injustice, where he lays out, I would say, a plan how to end the race to the bottom of tax dumping in the field of corporate taxation based on solid data, and in the past years equally contributed to the debate how to end tax havens and to measure the impact of tax dumping and tax havens on the global economy and public purchasing powers of states, as well as the distributional effect of the existence of tax competition on an international scale. At the same time, I'm also honored to have Catherine Olier here in this webinar. Catherine is a French lawyer. She was a campaigner for tax justice with Oxfam, and has been working for the Green Group in the Parliament now for quite a while. And all the files we had on money laundering, on tax evasion and tax competition, the inquiry committee, which came after the Panama Papers, all this work we have been doing together. And I'm very much a fan of her work, and therefore I'm very glad that she joins us today as well. And I'm also happy that the brilliant book of Gabriel has just been launched in Germany by a publisher which is well known in Germany, the Suhrkamp Verlag. And therefore, this is also the first online event on the book, and is also set to promote that book a bit in Germany. Obviously, we will speak now English, or what we regard as English, so all the Brexiteers have to take that we will mess with their language now without being corrected. And this webinar is run in English, but we have simultaneous translation in German. If you have a look on the chat panel, you can see a link which leads you to another pad where Tascha from Düsseldorf is doing her best, despite not being an economist or a financial lawyer, to translate what will be said. And at the same time, both have presented slides which will also help to follow the debate. I would also like to say that this webinar will be recorded, and afterwards people can watch it on the web. So therefore, everybody should know that this is recorded and published afterwards. Equally, the whole idea of that webinar is that it's mainly a space for you to learn from bright people, but also to have your say. So therefore, you can use the green hand function or the red hand function, depending on your control panel, in order to say that you would like to ask a question. And then after the two presentations, I will give the floor one after the other to those who have raised their fingers like in a normal conference room. And you can also ask questions in writing. Always it's good to be short and concise. You can also ask your questions in German, French, or English, as you like. And we will then try our best to use the written questions as well. Well, I would like to say, first of all, that for the Greens in the European Parliament, fighting tax competition and financial crime has been a top priority. First, because we care about the tax justice and income distribution side of things, but also because the unfettered tax competition in Europe is a real issue of concern for all those who love Europe, because Europe's reputation is harmed by a common market without common tax rules, which leads to increased inequalities in Europe. Gabriel has done a lot of research on the United States, but also in Europe, and I'm now very much curious to hear your plan how to get out of that tax maze. And please, Gabriel, you have the floor. We are honored to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to have the chance to talk about this research and this book, The Triumph of Injustice. This is joint work with Emmanuel Saez, my colleague at Berkeley. And so what we do in this work is that we study what we call tax injustice. And what is tax injustice? It's the process through which the main winners from globalization, so multinational companies and their shareholders, have seen their taxes fall, while at the same time, those who've not benefited a lot from globalization or sometimes have suffered from it, low-wage workers, retirees, small businesses, see their taxes increase. So to put it differently, tax injustice is the combination of two things: rising inequality on the one hand and falling tax progressivity on the other hand. And this phenomenon has been particularly marked in the case of the United States, because the US is the country where inequality has increased the most among developed countries, and where the progressivity of the tax system has declined the most. But tax injustice is also very much a reality in Europe. That's why in the first part of the book, we study in depth the case of the US, but in the second part of the book, we propose solutions that apply more broadly, that apply in particular very much to European countries. We try to provide some elements for a new tax system for the 21st century that will reconcile globalization on the one hand and progressive taxation on the other hand. So let me start with what has happened to inequality in the US. And this graph here is maybe the simplest way to illustrate the dramatic increase in income inequality in the US. This graph shows the share of income that's earned by the top 1% highest earners and the bottom 50% lowest earners, what we call in the book the working class. In 1980, the top 1% earned about 10% of total US national income. Today, the top 1% earns about 20%, so their share has been multiplied by 2. For the working class, for the bottom 50%, the evolution has been just the opposite. They used to earn about 20% of US national income. Now they earn barely more than 10–12% of total income. So dramatic changes in income concentration in the US. At the same time, the tax system has experienced profound evolution. The graph here that I'm showing depicts the progressivity or the lack of progressivity of the current US tax system in 2018. So just after the tax reform that was enacted at the end of 2017. On the x-axis, you have the different groups of the income distribution. So P0, 10 is the bottom 10%, the 10% of Americans with the lowest incomes. P10, 20 is the next 10%, and so on. And as we move to the top, we zoom into finer and finer groups, all the way up to the top 400 with just Americans. On the y-axis, you have the effective tax rate of each group. The effective tax rate is just the total amount of taxes paid, including all taxes at all levels of government, federal taxes, state and local government taxes, divided by pre-tax income. So for the working class, for the bottom 5 deciles, for the lower half of the income distribution, their pre-tax income on average is $18,500 per adult in 2018. And out of that pre-tax income, they pay almost around 25, 26% of their income in taxes. So their effective tax rate is close to the average macroeconomic tax rate of 28%. Then for the middle class, who has an income of about $75,000 per year, the tax rate is around 28%. So it's close to the macro average tax rate. For the upper middle class and the bottom of the top 1%, the tax rate rises a little bit before falling to 23% for the top richest Americans, that is for billionaires. So one way to summarize the US tax system today is that it looks like a giant flat tax where each group of the population has, roughly speaking, the same effective tax rate, with one notable exception, which is billionaires who have a lower rate than the working class and the middle class. And it is in fact the first year in 2018 that billionaires have a lower tax rate than bottom 50% earners. As this graph shows, in the 1960s and 1970s, the 400 richest Americans
So we lost Gabriel for a second. I'm sure he will dial in very soon again. C'est dommage. Let's wait a bit. All right, now he has a chance to dial in again. So now I will use the time to tell the story we had recently. We recently had such a webinar with an activist in Hong Kong. His web connection was clearly better than anything we ever had from Europe. This was now Paris, a world city. It's not better than in Germany. So even if they have clearly the advantage that they don't have CSU ministers responsible for it, but in the end, the result is not much better. Catherine, tu as son numéro de portable?
I don't think so.
Moi non plus. Ah, il est revenu. Gabriel? 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 Can you hear us? Can you hear us? Gabriel? Huh. Do you hear us? Do you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Could you switch off your webcam so that you can you have a more stable connection?
Okay.
So that yes. So please continue. It's a pity, but obviously the internet connection is not strong enough where you live.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. But so can you hear me now?
Yes, excellent.
Okay, so I'm not sure where this was interrupted, but I'll try to. I assume that I was talking about
exactly this one.
The fact that for the first time in 2018, billionaires have paid a lower tax rate than the rest of the population. So let me just say this again. In 2018, the effective tax rate for billionaires was 23%. That's less than the tax rate for the bottom 50% of earners. So this is a major departure from history in the US, because the US, it's very important to remember that the US pioneered progressive taxation, and in fact sharply progressive taxation. This graph shows, just to remind you of the reality of taxation in the US throughout the 20th century. From 1930 to 1980, the top marginal income tax rate averaged almost 80%. The top estate tax rate averaged about 77%. Just to realize how far the US went in terms of tax progressivity, we tell in the book the story, of the famous speech by Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, who goes to Congress in 1942 and says, in substance, look, I think that no American should have an income after paying taxes of more than $25,000. And so I propose, said Roosevelt, I propose to introduce a new tax of 100% above $25,000, which is the equivalent of 1 million of today's dollars. Or to put it differently, he proposes to introduce a legal maximum income of about 1 million of today's dollars. And Congress people in the US, they hesitate a little bit. 100%, maybe it's a bit too much, but they agree on a top tax rate of 93%, which is not very far from 100%, and they kept this 93% top marginal income tax rate throughout the 1940s, 1950s, early 1960s, so including under Republican administrations, including under Eisenhower. And that policy of quasi-confiscatory top marginal income tax rates reflects a long-standing idea in the US that's deeply rooted in US society, at least historically, which is the idea that wealth is power, and so an extreme concentration of wealth means an extreme concentration of power. Of economic power, of course, but also of political power, of the power to influence public policies, the power to influence ideology by funding think tanks and foundations, or buying newspapers, or creating new media. And so too much wealth inequality is corrosive for Republican administrations, for institutions, for democracy itself, and the tax system should be used to regulate inequality with a view to protecting democracy. That view is at least as old as the US itself, and triumphs in some sense under Roosevelt and his successors in the middle of the 20th century. Then things started to change in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan enters the White House, and he gives this famous speech on how government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. And this speech legitimizes tax avoidance and tax evasion. And indeed, you see tax avoidance increase dramatically starting in 1980s. Here is one illustration. This is a graph that shows the fraction of the foreign profits of US multinationals that are booked in tax havens. So today, US multinationals book about 55% of all their non-US profits in tax havens such as Ireland, Switzerland, Caribbean tax havens, Bermuda, Singapore, Puerto Rico, and so on. And this used to be less than 10–15% in 1960s, 1970s, and it's been growing very fast since the 1980s. The result of this is that tax collection, corporate income tax revenues in the US have declined very strongly, very substantially over the last decade. As this graph shows, in the 1950s, the corporate income tax generated about as much tax revenue as the individual income tax, about 7% of total US national income. Since then, individual income tax revenues have stabilized at around 7% of national income, but corporate income tax revenues have declined to as little as 1% of US national income in 2018. So we see here a tax, the corporate income tax, that used to be a major source of tax revenue and that is now almost dead, that has almost disappeared because of the forces of tax avoidance and of tax competition in particular. That's why the proposals that we make in the book start with fixing the corporate tax, and more broadly, our aim is to try to reconcile globalization with capital taxation and tax justice. Because I think that if globalization means ever lower and lower taxes for its main winners, multinational companies and their shareholders, then it's unlikely to be sustainable. We will see a growing disconnect between the people and globalization, between the people and European economic integration, if globalization and European economic integration mean always more tax injustice. But I want to emphasize the fact that the type of globalization that we have today is only one form of globalization among many other forms of globalization. And there is nothing inherent in globalization that prevents a high taxation of corporate profits. Tax competition is not a law of nature, it's a policy choice, and we can make other choices. So let me illustrate that idea with our plan to better tax multinational companies. And this plan is quite simple. It starts from the idea that for each company, any country can compute the tax deficit of a firm. What is the tax deficit of a firm? It's the difference between what this firm would have to pay if its profits were taxed at a rate of, let's say, 25% in each country where it operates, and the amount of taxes that this firm effectively pays. Okay, so for Apple, for BMW, for Nestle, for any company, the German tax authority or the French tax authority can compute the tax deficit of that firm. And then it's possible for any country unilaterally to try to collect all or some of that tax deficit. So for instance, Germany could say, we, Germany, are going to collect 100% of the tax deficit of German firms. And for foreign companies, for instance, for Apple or Google or Amazon, we are going to collect a fraction of their tax deficit. What fraction? Well, the fraction that corresponds to the fraction of their global sales that they make in Germany. So for instance, Google in 2018 made $20 billion in revenue in Bermuda, where the corporate tax rate is 0%. So there is a tax deficit here. Right now, there's no country that collects the taxes that Bermuda chooses not to collect. And what we're saying is other countries could choose to act as tax collectors.
Hmm.
10% of its global sales in Germany, Germany could collect 10% of the global tax of Google.
Gabriel? Gabriel?
The face of globalization.
Gabriel,
why? Because right now the type of globalization that we have is characterized.
Gabriel, there was another interruption, and basically you had to explain your model of collecting the tax by the share of sales again. And if you can still kick out any user of your Wi-Fi, it remains to be helpful to ensure a stable connection. And I use this short interruption to welcome all the new participants and all those who struggle with economic English. Please use in parallel the pad, which can be found under the chat. There's a link to a simultaneous written German translation done from Düsseldorf. So, Gabriel, sorry about this, but please continue.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry about this interruption. So just can you confirm that I can go ahead?
Yes, we hear you now very well.
Okay. So let me explain. So the one of the key ideas that we're defending in this book about how to better tax multinational companies. And the idea is that for each firm, any country can compute what we call the tax deficit of that firm. What is the tax deficit of a firm? It's the difference between what this firm would pay in taxes if it was subject to an effective tax rate of, let's say, 25% in each of the countries where it operates, and what this firm effectively currently pays in taxes today. Okay, so the German tax authority can compute the tax deficit of any country, of any firm in the world, of Apple, of Google, of BMW, and then it can choose to collect all or part of this tax deficit. So, for instance, the German tax authority could say, for firms that are headquartered in Germany, Germany, are going to collect 100% of their tax deficits. If BMW has a tax deficit, pays less than 25% in some foreign countries, Germany is going to collect the difference between 25% and what BMW pays in, what the effective tax rate of BMW is in Ireland or in tax havens. For foreign firms like Google, for instance, Google in 2018 made $20 billion in revenue in Bermuda, where the corporate tax rate is 0%. So there is a tax deficit there. There is no country that taxes the profits in Bermuda, that collects the taxes that Bermuda chooses not to collect. And what we are saying, our proposal, is that some countries should act as tax collectors of last resort. So, for instance, if Google makes 20% of its sales in Germany, Germany could say, we are going to collect 20% of Google's tax deficit. Okay, and so to offset the taxes that Google doesn't pay abroad, there's going to be increased taxation in Germany. So let me just mention that in such a system, I think such a proposal can really change the face of globalization. Why is that the case? That's the case because today the type of globalization that we have is characterized by tax competition, so a very negative form of international competition, tax dumping, countries slashing their tax rates to attract economic activity from abroad. But with the proposal that I just described, here is what would happen. Imagine that Germany unilaterally starts collecting the tax deficit of multinational firms. And imagine that it proves that it can, it works, it can generate extra tax revenue from these firms that pay too little today. I think very quickly we would see other countries saying, doing the same, because look, not collecting the tax deficit means leaving money on the table for other countries to grab. And so quite quickly, we could see countries, Germany, France, Italy, the US, starting collecting the tax deficit of multinational firms. As soon as sufficiently many countries do that, it would become pointless for multinational companies to book earnings in tax havens, because lower taxes in Bermuda or Ireland would be offset by higher taxes in Germany or Italy or France or the US. And because it would become pointless for firms to book earnings in tax havens, these tax havens wouldn't have any incentive anymore to offer low tax rates in the first place. And so they would start increasing their tax rates. And so you see how we can move from the race to the bottom that currently rages in the EU and at the global level. We could quite quickly move to a race to the top, where countries increase their tax rates and we get to some form of harmonization around higher rates of 25 or 30%. Now, once tax rates are outside of the picture, once all countries have similar tax rates, there would still be international competition, but it would be a different form. It would be a more positive form of international competition. Countries would still compete to attract companies, but they would compete by providing the best infrastructure, by having the most highly skilled workforce, so by having the best universities, by investing more in higher education and in research and development. And so we move to another form of globalization that benefits the working class and the middle class. And so you see how a proposal that looks quite technical like that can in fact contribute to reconciling the people with globalization. Okay, let me, if I'm still here, if you can still hear me, let me talk about taxing wealth very quickly, and then I'll conclude. The other idea that we defend in the book, in terms of proposals, is the idea of progressive wealth taxation. Why do we need wealth taxes? Because the wealth taxes are the proper way to tax the very rich, in particular to tax billionaires. And why is that the case? Is because when you're super wealthy, when you're a billionaire, you can own a ton of wealth while having little taxable income. In the book, we take the example of Warren Buffett. He's worth something like $60 billion, but his taxable income is only a few $1 million because he instructs his company not to pay dividends. And so even, if the US increased its top marginal income tax rate, it would make no difference to how much taxes someone like Warren Buffett pays. But with a wealth tax on the stock of wealth itself, it could make a huge difference. Of course, many countries, or to put it differently, some people have a lot of wealth and little taxable income. Some people have a lot of income and relatively little wealth. So you need two instruments, to tax the wealthy well. You need both an income tax and a wealth tax. So of course, many countries have had wealth taxes in Europe. Today, Switzerland and Norway have wealth taxes. In the past, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, among other countries, used to have wealth taxes. And there are lessons to be learned from the European experience with wealth taxation. These wealth taxes were far from perfect, in particular because the EU tolerates tax competition. In each of these countries, if you're very wealthy and you move abroad, then you stop being taxable immediately. So for instance, if you're a French billionaire and you choose to move to Switzerland, then starting January 1st, 2021, you don't have any taxes to pay in France anymore. And that this is very extreme. And the US is the opposite extreme. In the US, if you are a US citizen and you move abroad, you still have to pay taxes in the US until you die. So that's the polar opposite. One of the proposals that we're making is that maybe we can have a middle ground where if you've been a tax resident in France for 30, 40 years, let's say, and you choose to move abroad, to a tax haven, you would still have to pay taxes in France for maybe 5-10 years, maybe depending on the number of years that you've been a tax resident in France. And the logic behind that is very strong. The logic is, if you become a billionaire in France, it's great, but it's in large part because of the French infrastructure, French workers that have been trained by French teachers, and can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and so all people in France have contributed to your success through their taxes, and so there's no natural right to stop paying taxes immediately if you choose to move to a tax haven. So that's one way that wealth taxation can be improved compared to what used to be done in Europe by taxing expatriates. There are a number of proposals right now in the US by Bernie Sanders, by Elizabeth Warren, to introduce wealth taxes, and opinion polls show that these proposals are extremely popular. So typically that about 70% of Democrats support the idea of taxing wealth, and more than 50% of Republican voters and independents support the idea of taxing wealth. So this is likely to be a hot issue, not only in the US, but also in Europe. So let me conclude by saying that the widely held view that external or technical constraints make tax justice impossible, in my view, is wrong. There is technically nothing in globalization that prevents progressive taxation. Tolerating tax competition, tolerating tax evasion, tax avoidance are policy choices, and collectively we can make other choices. There is an infinity of possible future policy paths, and where economists can be helpful is in two ways. One is by making more concrete the multiplicity of these possible futures, and second is by acting a little bit like plumbers. So Esther Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize, she has a very famous article that's titled "The Economist as a Plumber," and I think it applies very well for economists that work like myself on tax issues, in the sense that there are leaks in the tax system, there's tax avoidance, there's tax evasion, and we economists, we can help fixing the leaks. All right. Thank you very much, and sorry for the technical problems.
Thank you, Gabriel, for this excellent insight into your book. And I can only say this is only a start. To read the whole book is still worthwhile. There's a lot of more data and intelligent arguments in it. So do not hesitate to buy either the English, the French, or the German version of it. But now, let's first listen to Catherine Olier. As I said, because I saw a lot of new people joining, a French lawyer who has, on the level of the group staff of our Green Group in the European Parliament, led the work on tax justice and the fight against financial crime. Formerly, she was with Oxfam, and we are looking now forward to listening to her and what we have been doing and proposing in the European Parliament, and then I would like to discuss this together and to see what we can learn from Gabriel for our European fight to bring about tax justice and a financial world with a lot less financial crime. Catherine, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So I think you will have the PowerPoint showing up in a few seconds, but you asked me to present a little bit the progress that we have seen at the European level over the past 5 years, and also some things that remain to be done in order to make sure that we walk the path towards tax justice. So I will pick up where Gabriel left us about the fact that tax evasion is very much a policy choice, and that we can do things have a different path and to work towards tax justice. And I would say before the financial crisis in the 2007-2008 years, people were not really interested into tax havens and the missing billions. But the fact that we had the bailout of banks and economic downturns, people started to question where is untaxed money going, and we should try to maybe tax this money going away offshore. But the real game changer, I would say, in Europe is the LuxLeaks scandal. You may remember that in November 2014, a consortium of journalists all over the world, and especially in Europe, published information about over 300 companies, including very, very famous companies like Apple, Amazon, IKEA, or even Deutsche Bank. And those companies, thanks to an accounting firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, managed to negotiate their tax rate with the Luxembourg tax administration. And this scandal showed very much that tax havens were not just sunny islands far away, but were actually countries at the heart of Europe and neighboring countries from Germany and France. So this was really a game changer to show that we needed to address the problem. And the new European Commission at the time was led by Jean-Claude Juncker, who just started to work as a president of the European Commission. And he was the former prime minister and finance minister of Luxembourg. So, of course, it helped us as Greens here, who were fighting for tax justice for years already, to really make sure that the new commission would have tax justice and fighting tax evasion and avoidance as a real priority. What we have done, I mean, the Greens were very strong in really putting pressure at the European level to make sure that there would be a response to those tax scandals. And in the European Parliament, we were calling to really respond to a series of scandals. So LuxLeaks was the first one in November 2014, but you may also have heard about the Panama Papers that happened in 2016 and the Paradise Papers in 2017. And in all cases, our political group here, under the leadership of Sven and other MEPs, including, for example, Eva Joly in France, who's been fighting crime as a judge before, we have pushed to create special committees and inquiry committees to look into tax evasion, tax avoidance, and money laundering, and make recommendation in order to put pressure on the European Commission and the member states and the ministers so that they pass legislation. And the outcome of this work is now that the European Parliament is going to have a permanent subcommittee working on those questions for the next 5 years. So we're really going to continue to put the pressure on this. In terms of progress made, because Ben asked me to show that we are progressing towards the path for tax justice, we have a series of legislation that were passed over the last 5 years, really to fight tax avoidance by individuals, but also tax avoidance by companies. So, for example, we have now legislation to make sure that there is an automatic exchange of tax information between tax administration in the different member states. That means if you own a bank account somewhere in a country where you're not a citizen, the tax administration of your country, so if you're a German and you have a bank account in Luxembourg, the tax administration in Germany is going to know about it. So you better declare it because you have the obligation to do it. And that's a way to fight individuals that are hiding money offshore in order not to pay taxes. For companies, we have also passed legislation closing loopholes that companies were able to use in order to avoid paying taxes. For example, one way for a company to avoid paying taxes is to create a high amount of debt in one of its subsidiaries in a country where you pay a lot of taxes, let's say Germany or France, for example, and to make sure that the interest of that debt are paid to a subsidiary in a country where you pay very low tax. And could be in Europe or outside Europe. And in this way, you manage to shift your profits to countries where you pay little taxes. In terms of progress made, we have also managed to have a European blacklist of tax havens. This is a list that is adopted by the member states, which now finally lists big names like Panama and Cayman Islands. But this list has really had the merit of pushing third countries to adapt their tax legislation in order to close some of the tax regimes that are really helping companies to not pay taxes. The downside of this list is that it's only for third countries, and it doesn't address the problems we have from some European countries, because it's only a list for non-European countries. But at least it has managed to push some countries to adapt their legislation because they didn't want to be blacklisted, and those who refuse to move or are not compliant, like Panama or Cayman Island, have been added to the list. We've also made progress, or the progress are still ongoing, about taxing the digital economy. Gabriel was talking a lot about Google or other big giants like Apple, Facebook, Amazon, who were in the news over the past few years for not paying taxes, because those companies are digital by essence. So they're different from typical companies that have assets and buildings and other assets in the different countries they work in. So they can move their profits more easily around and declare their activities in countries where you pay very low taxes. And here the work is in progress because we have now international negotiations with over 130 countries negotiating, and they have set themselves a deadline until November 2020 in order to find a common agreement to better tax activities from the digital economy and to make sure that companies would pay more taxes where they have their sales and their clients. So we'll see in a few months if they manage to find an agreement. And if not, the European Union, the European Commission has already said that they would move forward with a proposal, with a legislation, if an agreement cannot be found. And finally, in terms of progress made, we have also made progress to fight economic crime and money laundering. And here, a new legislation was adopted in 2017 and actually entered into force last month. And under the leadership of the Greens, who were co-leading the negotiations for this legislation, we have managed to get a strong set of standards in place in order to fight money laundering. You may have heard about scandals from Danske Bank in Denmark and in Latvia, or also the Pilatus Bank in Malta, where criminals were hiding their money and laundering their money through those banks and those hubs. With the new legislation, we have made sure that we really have more rules to know who is behind a company or a trust, because that's the basic. If you want to hide your money, you have to hide yourself under a certain number of companies and trusts and other corporate structures, so nobody can find who you are. But here we've put in place some standards to make sure that we will always know the physical person, the physical owner behind those companies and legal structures. And we've also, for example, made sure that there would also be a blacklist for third countries who present high risks of money laundering, on the same model of a blacklist for tax havens. And we have made sure that member states will work together more in order to fight money laundering, because the money laundering doesn't know any borders. So member states really need to work together and exchange information to find the criminals. But as I said at the beginning, more needs to be done, and this is work in progress. We're fighting here with the Greens in Brussels to try to get stronger rules. And it starts, for example, with transparency. One basic reform that we want to have is to make sure that we know where companies pay their taxes. So they would have to publish where they employ people, where they sell things, and where they book their profits. And with this, you'll be able to know if they really pay their taxes and they declare their profits, where they employ the people and where they sell those goods, which means that's where they have their real economic activities. And here we have a problem because the reform is actually being blocked by our own member states. And Germany, I have to say here, is not very helpful because they don't want to take a position and they're abstaining on this very important reform. Another thing is, as Gabriel mentioned, we need to make sure that we have a common way of taxing companies at the European level, in order to make sure that we can also have a minimum taxation of those companies. There is ongoing discussions about how to tax companies the same way all over Europe, but those discussions are actually not very much progressing because some member states who are tax havens in the European Union, including Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, or Cyprus, are actually not very keen on changing the rules because it would mean they would have to change the whole economic model. And in terms of minimum taxation, make sure that companies have to pay at least a certain amount of tax. The Greens have been calling for 20% minimum tax rate, but this is something where we are still working on because, of course, the member states are also not very keen on adopting this proposal. And finally, the people who want to cheat are quite smart and innovative, and they always try to find new ways in order to bypass the new legislation. So there's a numbers of new problems that as Greens we have identified, which are new regimes where you can try to avoid paying taxes. So for example, golden visas is a way for rich foreigners to buy citizenship in Malta or in Portugal, which will give them access to the European market and to European citizenship, and they would be able to move their dirty money in Europe with a European citizenship. So it's also very dangerous because it would be harder to know if they really pay taxes on this. There's also still the possibility, for example, if you want to launder your money, to still hide behind strawmen, so behind people who are supposed to own a company, but they're actually only owning on behalf of the real owner. And so this is something that we want to fight as well in the upcoming change of the rules on money laundering. So we are making progress in conclusion, but we still need to make sure that the proposals that are blocked are adopted by our member states, and that we also address the potential new forms of tax evasion and tax avoidance in Europe.
Thank you. Merci, Catherine. As you can see, beyond countries in the Greens in the European Parliament, we have no humor when it comes to financial crime and tax evasion and tax avoidance. But you can see there are differences between a big vision, which is basically a global vision as presented by Gabriel, and our legislative trail we are following in the European framework. So we will take the time later to compare that. But first of all, I would like to give the floor to some of the citizens who have indicated that they would love to speak. So I have also received some written questions. So when I now give you the floor, please be concise and tell us briefly where you are from. And I start with Gerhard Roth. Let's see whether this is working. Gerhard, please. Gerhard Roth? Silence over Gerhard Roth. Let's ask the next person, Ben Pflüger or Pfluger. Huh? You still have to switch on your microphone, otherwise it is not working. No, I can't activate you, unfortunately. So, but Martin Harrison, do you hear us?
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes, please, your question. Where are you from?
Well,
we know each other, but please present yourself.
Yeah, Martin Harrison. I'm a British-German citizen in Frankfurt. In order to tax, Gabriel, in order to tax the global profits of these companies, you actually have to know what the global profits are. And what we've seen in the Enron scandal and lots of other cases is that these companies are experts at creating income and wealth off balance sheets, of creating complex structures where even if it's open, you can't actually figure out exactly what the tax income is. And they're very good. Whatever rule you invent, they'll try and find a way around it. I mean, one thing that occurred to me just now, maybe it's not possible, I don't know, but they could maybe set up in some jurisdiction companies small enough that they don't have to publish their accounts, and these companies lend the multinational money at extortionate interest rates in order to suck the profits out of the Europe and the US or whatever, and then these multinationals companies own these smaller companies. And so another way of basically getting around the issue by concealing. I was going to suggest a number of possible solutions. One is just simply taxing the revenue. They can't hide that very easily. The other is a completely different way of calculating profits using the cash flows, which takes far too long to explain. The other one, what really bugs me, is how slow the legislators are to respond. I mean, you're playing a cat and mouse game, and you're the cat, but they are the mouse, and they can always move more quickly than you. And I think
Martin,
sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was very clear. Thank you very much. I would like to connect your question to one written question which was put to us, which has something in common with what Martin said. It's by Aurore Chardonnay. I think she also works with Oxfam, am I right? Or with with one of the Brussels-based NGOs working on tax justice. And the question is very simple. On profits booked in tax havens, we notice a decrease from 2014 to 2017. Do you think this is a consequence from the fight for tax justice? Gabriel, perhaps you have a go first.
Yes, well, I think that, in the current system, it's very easy for companies to manipulate the location of their profits. And so it's very easy to book earnings in Bermuda, in Ireland, in Luxembourg, even if the profits have been made elsewhere. I think it's somewhat harder to manipulate the amount of profits made overall globally, by the consolidated entities. So of course there are examples of that, and you mentioned Enron, and that's a good example. But that's outright fraud, and that exists, but that's rarer than just manipulating the location of earnings across jurisdictions. So there's no tax base that's perfect. Profits can be, there can be tax evasion, revenues, the same. Profits makes a bit more sense to tax than revenues, because profits, it's a tax on profits is income that accrues to shareholders, and so by taxing profits, you're taxing in effect shareholders. Revenues, it's less clear what you're really taxing when you're doing that. But my short answer would be that I think we can make tremendous progress if we move towards a system with country by country minimum taxes of, as I was saying, in my presentation, 25%, for instance. That would make a dramatic change. That would make a dramatic difference in how much taxes multinational corporations pay today.
Yes, and there was the question from Aurore Chardonnay, how you explain the reduction of profits booked in tax havens between 2014 and 17.
That I'm less sure that there is something very significant that has happened over that period of time. At least when I look at the profits booked by US multinational companies in tax havens, there doesn't seem to be a massive or very statistically significant decline in the fraction of their earnings that they book in tax havens. It still seems to be around 55, 60%. Look, there is important effort that's being done by the OECD with BEPS, and so we might see some progress in 2018, in 2019, but in the data that exists so far, I think profit shifting is still, on the rise.
Yes, thank you. I would like to read out two more questions, of which one is also going to explicitly to Catherine. First, there's Christian Stricker asking a question to Gabriel and Catherine. What are your opinions on the proposed Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base, short CCCTB, in the EU? Thank you. And second, a question by Martin Köller. Martin Köller has written a very interesting piece on bilateral trade agreements, and he's asking the following. Hi, I would like to know if investment treaties could prevent states to adopt Gabriel's policies because they would be sued in front of ISDS tribunals. Catherine, do you want to start?
Sure, and maybe I can just explain very briefly what is the CCCTB. So the Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base, which is a very fancy acronym, is actually a way, if the proposition is adopted, which is one of the legislation that is blocked, for looking at the profits of companies at the European level and make sure that countries can tax the profits of those companies according to where the company makes its economic activity. So, for example, if you would have 20% of your sales and your employees and assets in Germany, then Germany would be able to tax 20% of those profits of the companies. And this is a proposal that as Greens we have been supporting very much. We have always said that for us it's important to have a common tax base so that we have the same rule at the European level to tax the companies on the same base, but also that we have this consolidated approach so that we look at the profits of the companies from a European perspective. Unfortunately, this is a proposal that is being blocked in Council because the member states need to have a unanimous agreement. So 27 member states have to agree on it. And it means also for the countries who are basically today tax havens like Luxembourg or Ireland or Cyprus or Malta, that they will lose out a lot of their business model as a tax haven, so they're not really in favor. We've always said as well that this common consolidated corporate tax base should also come with a minimum tax rate, because if we find some rules to tax companies on their tax base, then the next competition is going to move on the tax rate, and the countries are going to go into a race to the bottom to tax profits less and less. So that's why we also want to have a common tax rate at the European level, so that there could not be a disastrous tax competition between the different member states.
Gabriel, merci.
Yes, I totally agree with what Catherine just said about the CCCTB. It's a very important initiative, and especially if combined with minimum country-by-country tax rates. On the second question of whether the proposal of collecting the tax deficit of multinational companies would be compatible with existing trade agreements, I'm not a legal expert. I've been talking about these issues with people who know much more than me about international agreements, and they seem to believe that this system would be compatible both with EU regulations and with international treaties. If it's not, I think then we need to change the treaties. We need to put taxes at the heart of international trade agreements. I don't think it makes sense to have trade agreements or new trade agreements today that are only about property protection and investor dispute settlement, and don't talk at all about taxes, because property cannot come with only rights and no tax duty. And so we must put taxes, tax coordination, tax harmonization at the center of trade agreements.
Merci, Gabriel. I will try to give some other citizens the floor. I start with Emmanuel Matondo.
Yes, thank you. Emmanuel Matondo. I am an Angolan citizen based in Germany since now 30 years, based in Bonn. I'm a journalist working on illicit capital flows from Africa to tax haven, more than 25 years. As you mentioned, my question is, what do you think about corporate making profit in a country like Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, the case of Glencore, paying really no tax, but bring all the money to Switzerland? In which way you can manage that? It's the first question. And the second question, how you think to deal with those banks with customers, with non-resident customers? Because following the revelation of Luanda leaks, Cape Verde government announced today they will close all the banks working with non-resident customers in the way to make the market, the finance place transparent and to fight money laundering. It's the second question. And the third question would be,
Okay.
what do you think, Miss Catherine Olier, that there is no European country in the blacklist? According to tax haven index, all major countries, European countries, are among the top 20 of tax haven best secrecy offshore.
Merci. Thank you. I was, because I have a lot of sympathy of your work, I allowed you asking 3 questions, but thank you. They were pertinent. Perhaps Catherine can start. It's also close to things she has been working on in the past. Catherine, please.
Yes, thanks. So maybe just on the first question about companies, working in developing countries and taking profits away and not paying taxes there. There's a lot of things that developing countries can do, starting by transparency. I mentioned, that the importance to have legislation to know where companies pay taxes. Most of the companies working in developing countries, they extract minerals and natural resources. So those natural resources are not going away. If you want to extract gold or other minerals, you're going to have to be in this country. And as a country, those governments, they have power to make sure that companies would then have to publish how much minerals they extract, how many people they employ, etc., so that you could make sure that the developing countries could pay taxes in there. So there's a lot of things to be done around transparency of the contracts to exploit natural sites, but also to publish, those companies should publish what they do in those countries so that you can make sure they are being taxed. And this is also something that we are asking the European countries to do, to make sure they are coherent, because they do development assistance, but we also want to make sure that they help those developing countries to have a proper tax administration and to know what's going on in their countries. On the issue of non-resident customer by banks, this is a big problem. Indeed, you have some banks who have very risky business because they take on a lot of non-resident customers. This was also the case, for example, with the ABVL bank in Latvia, who collapsed. And of course, what we are asking is for stronger supervision of those banks. We have supervision of the banking sector in Europe, but clearly you have banks who go for very risky business models, and those banks should be properly supervised, because the more risky business model you have, the more risk you have to do money laundering. So they have to be properly supervised. And on the blacklist of tax havens, indeed, unfortunately, it's a blacklist for third countries, because the official position of the member states is that there is no tax haven in Europe, which as Greens we've been fighting against, because we know that some countries have a business model of being a tax haven. The European Commission has a different tool than the blacklist. They have country reports, which they have actually this year published yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, where they do country reports on the economic model of the different member states. And in this reports, they have shown that 6 countries, Cyprus, Ireland, Luxembourg, Hungary, Malta, and the Netherlands, are actually countries that behave as tax havens. They don't say it very openly like this, but they say that the tax system allows companies or individuals to not pay taxes. So there is a little bit work here. It's not really binding. It's not as strong as a blacklist, but we are pushing very hard to make sure that those countries are recognized for facilitating tax evasion, tax avoidance.
Merci, Gabriel.
Yes, I very much agree with all of this. I will just add 2 quick points. First, for developing countries, I think that international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank could play a useful role in helping developing countries improve their income tax system. So for a very long time, what these international organizations have been doing is only provide help with value-added taxes, consumption taxes, and very little assistance when it comes to corporate taxation, progressive income taxation, wealth taxation, estate and inheritance taxation. And I think that needs to change. The way that today's rich countries have become rich is not by taxing consumption. You know, when you look at the history of taxes in Germany, in France, in the US, progressive income taxes and corporate taxes play a key role as a source of tax revenue and as a source of tax justice. And so I think it's very important for international organizations to play a positive role in that area. The second point is about financial transparency, how to fight opacity. In my previous book, The Hidden Wealth of Nations, I made one proposal in that direction, which is to create financial registries recording the ownership of assets like equities, bonds, mutual fund shares. Most countries have real estate and land registries, and my proposal is to extend those registries to financial assets as a way to better measure simply who owns what, and to limit this way tax evasion, money laundering, and so on. So I think it could be a very valuable goal for the EU to create at least initially an EU financial registry that eventually could become a global asset registry.
Yes, and I have to say we have made some steps towards that in Europe when it comes to real estate and also when it comes to corporate accounts, including shell companies, but this is not yet all. We are working on it. I would like to read 2 questions which are going back to the basic idea of a new form of, I would put it, new form of source taxation, which has been proposed by Gabriel. And there are 2 questions asked, which are truly interesting, I think. One is by Andreas Kiefer, and he's saying, that raises the question how to slice the cake. Slicing the cake by sales does not necessarily reflect the value chain international corporations have. And the second question is in writing. He has asked more questions, but I will read now the part which connects well to this other one. And the question is by Klaus Hochkogler. This sounds very Austrian to me, but yeah, exactly. He's saying that He's from the local Green Party from Mödling, close to Vienna. So I got it right, but with the strange differences of speaking German. And he's asking the following to Gabriel. Theory sounds nice, but how would you collect the tax deficit in reality? You'd need to topple tax law upside down. Sounds nice, but unreal. So tough question from Austria. Gabriel, what do you say about this?
Yeah, no, I think it's not so hard because look, one of the progress that has happened in the context of the OECD BEPS process is that now tax authorities have country by country reports of the income and taxes and sales of multinationals. And there is an exchange, an automatic exchange of country by country reports across tax authorities. So what this means is that, for instance, the German tax authority knows not only the country by country income statements of German firms, but also has the country by country reports of foreign companies like US multinationals or French multinationals. And in those country by country reports, you have all the information you need to compute the tax deficit. Okay, the tax deficit is, let's tax the profits in each country at 25%. Let's see how much revenue this would generate, and the difference between taxes, in that scenario and what the company effectively pays is the tax deficit. So this is doable. The information is there. Now, what fraction of the tax deficit? That's the first question. What fraction of the tax deficit should be collected by each country? There are different ways, to allocate the tax deficit. And one simple way is to use sales. That's easy and robust because it's very hard for firms to move their customers across borders. The customers, they are where they are. They will never move to Bermuda or to Ireland. So that's one reason why sales is appealing. But there are other ways, you can use other formulas to allocate the tax deficit, and eventually that's something that would need ideally to be agreed on in an international agreement. But in some sense, this question of how to allocate taxing rights across countries is not the most important question. The most important question is to make sure that all multinational companies are effectively taxed at a high enough minimum tax rate on a country by country basis. To me, that seems the key to be. I think this is the key issue.
Thank you. I see another Nurila Baston. You have not switched on your microphone. I would love to give you the floor, but you need to switch on your microphone. The next one here is Ben Pflüger or Pfluger. No microphone can be opened either. Please try to connect. Yeah. And Klaus von Warnen. Hallo Klaus.
Hallo?
Klaus? Ja, jetzt hören wir dich. Hallo.
Yeah. My name is Klaus van Waan from Germany. I'm a member of the Green Party. I live at the Lower Rhine near the Netherlands border. So we talk to Greens of the Netherlands also to these points of taxation. My point is the multinational company Linde is listed at the DAX share index of Germany, and they have a law system of PLC, I think Anglo-American or something like that. How can it be that an Anglo-American company is listed in the DAX?
Thank you. That was very clear. Thank you. I would use the opportunity, because I'm soon running out of questions, to put one question to Gabriel myself, which is the following. Of course, your proposal is a total change in the way how we at the moment calculate the tax base of corporate entities internationally. So first you were saying one could use the data which we get now from country by country reporting, which we already have between tax administrations. My guess would be, once some countries such as France, Germany would start your system, other countries would say, okay, you are leaving the global emerging consensus in the OECD for tax reform. We will stop giving you the data, because this was very hard to negotiate, and probably other countries internationally, if they wouldn't join your system, would retaliate by stopping the cooperation. Second, which I take equally seriously, is the whole logic comes from a logic of, as you were saying, larger countries being able and strong enough to impose source taxes. And indeed, this is a possibility always, and I think we had a wrong ideology of saying in a globalizing world, countries cannot do that anymore. I share your analysis that there's much more space for this, but of course, it is an uncooperative approach of doing this if you do it unilaterally. So therefore, to me, a much more logical approach would be that we say in Europe, we want a truly European system, but if some tax havens are continuing to block all the progress, we will go to the Zucman proposal. So for me, your proposal is a brilliant threat in negotiations, as long as we cannot get to a common consolidated corporate tax base plus minimum tax rates. So therefore, to me, this is a suboptimal solution, because it will be a potential strong conflict between member states who can tax what if you do it unilaterally. But if it would be a coordinated threat, it could be a game changer in Europe. So I'm quite interested what you think about these 2 points.
Yeah, these are great questions, and let me emphasize that I am a strong advocate of course, international coordination and international agreements and European agreements. I think this is, of course, the goal. Now, the EU has been discussing the CCCTB. The first discussions date back to 1975. So that's 45 years. And we've not made progress. This is still being blocked. So it's important at some point to have concrete plans for, moving forward. And I think it's not necessarily unilateral actions, but you can have small, number of member states, taking a common stance, like Germany plus France, or Germany, France, and Spain could say, look, we want to move forward. We're not going to wait for Luxembourg and Ireland to agree to CCCTB plus minimum tax. We are going to move forward with collecting the tax deficit of multinational companies. And I think this, in practice, is likely to be a game changer, to start a dynamic where we collectively at the EU level eventually reach an agreement. This is how it has happened for bank secrecy. Remember, before 2010, there was no exchange of bank information whatsoever between tax havens and other countries' tax authorities. Then the US took unilateral actions against Swiss banks, and that is what paved the way for the automatic exchange of bank information that's now in place. A form of international coordination that was deemed completely utopian by all experts in that area 10 years ago, and now which is a reality. But if we had, waited for Switzerland to agree and all the tax havens to agree without, this US unilateral action, that would have been much less progress, I think. And on your first question, very briefly, I want to stress that the system that I propose is not a big departure from the current situation. That is
Gabriel? We lost him. Gabriel?
For companies that have an effective tax rate of more than 25% on a country-by-country basis.
Gabriel?
Yes.
We lost you for about 40 seconds.
Oh, sorry. So, can you hear me now?
Yes, but you have to go back about 40 seconds.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So let me say again very briefly on your first point. I wanted to stress that my proposal is not a big departure compared to the current situation, in the sense that for the firms that already have a 25% effective tax rate or more on a country-by-country basis, for these firms, nothing would change. It's only for the firms that have a tax deficit, so that pay less than 25% in at least one country, that something would change. These firms would have to pay extra taxes to the countries where they make their sales. So it's a very modest, in fact, proposal that just says, for the firms that have a tax deficit, they have to pay a bit more, but many firms don't have a tax deficit. For them, nothing changes. So that's why I think it's not something that's aggressive or a big departure from the status quo. It's just adding this idea of some countries need to act as tax collectors of last resort. That's lacking in the current system. That's what makes tax dodging possible. And some countries need to step in as tax collectors of last resort.
Catherine, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just maybe wanted to add one point about the comment from our friend from Austria about reality check. And from the past 8 years, I've been working on tax at the European level, and building on what Gabriela said, I think nothing is impossible. But a few years ago, we couldn't dream about automatic exchange of tax information, of having a European blacklist of tax havens. So I would say what's lacking is the political will from our governments to make things change. And that's where really it's important to work at country level, including in Austria and a few other countries. But in practice, we can think about new ways of taxing companies, as Gabriel is proposing. Our only problem is the finance ministers blocking it.
Yes. Gabriel, do you have still time for a last round of questions and then to wrap up?
Yep.
Okay. So the last questions I have here for you. First, there is a question by Thomas Frister, who asks whether we are in touch with the Tax Justice Network. I can only ensure we all know each other. I was formerly the global chair of it. The tax justice progressive community, we all know each other and we cooperate globally, and we are proud of it. But he's asking beyond that, whether we could use the Brexit negotiations in order to get concessions from the United Kingdom and their related tax havens, and would it be possible to publicly denounce the role of the City of London and the islands in tax evasion and tax avoidance? Second question, is by Yannick Schwarz, and he's asking the following to explicitly Gabriel, but I know it's a favorite subject of Catherine as well. Can the OECD, if really be the forum that grants poorer countries more of the global tax share vis-à-vis the OECD countries? Since smaller countries might not have the political clout to follow through with unilateral policies, what alternative is there for them? Lobbying for a move of global tax negotiations to a UN forum? Question mark. Yeah, and yes, this I will do with a concluding question, with a wrap up, and then let me check briefly. Yes, and then there is a question by Andreas Lohrer. Why is Germany not part of the solution, but part of the problem? As German myself, I really get angry about my country, and I wonder what are the motives behind that obstacle. Looking forward to hear also from you what you think about this. So perhaps this is the final round. Gabriel, I'm also very curious if you have any additional advice to us in the European Parliament, what we should do. Please tell us, and then Catherine and I will conclude then this interesting webinar. Please, perhaps you start this time, Catherine, so that Gabriel has the last word from the side of the guests. Please.
Of course. On the Brexit negotiations, this is very much on the radar of the European Commission. The risks of the UK turning into a tax haven, even more already than the City of London is doing, and also the role of the overseas territories. I mean, no one can know how the negotiations will go for the future relationship, but this is clearly something that's high on the political radar. And of course, if the UK wants to have access to the internal market, this is part of the things that they will have to commit to respect the European standards, including on tax and money laundering. So for now, we don't know how it will go, but this is clearly a leverage if the UK wants to have access to the internal market. On the role of the OECD for tax policy settler and whether we have alternatives. Well, the reality is that today the OECD is the Secretariat for International Negotiations, and they, for example, on digital taxation, coordinate over 130 countries. So in reality, we have the OECD that is playing a global role, but it's true that you have over 130 countries, but if you read the press, sometimes you have the impression that it's only France and the United States discussing how we will make a future proposal. So the official position of the Parliament and of the Greens is that we are calling for a UN tax body so that we can have a truly inclusive framework. But no matter if you put it in the OECD or in the UN, you would still have the difficulty of getting all the countries to reach an international agreement. So this is still a reality that if we need a global consensus. And finally, on Germany, this is a very hard question. And here I'm just going to try to guess a little bit, but Sven probably has way more comments here. But well, Germany, it's true, is identified as a blocker on key reforms. I mentioned the issue of transparency, where they're not voting in favor. Sometimes they're also in favor of a common consolidated corporate tax base, so they're not blocking on everything, but it's true that they're not the most enthusiastic country for tax justice. The issue here, maybe one thing, is the lobby of big companies towards the government, but I will let Sven elaborate a bit more on this.
Gabriel.
Yes, I agree with what Catherine said. I don't have much to add to what she just said. This is very important and very correct. The only thing I would mention is, and that's related to the question on Brexit and to some extent Germany is the following. We can fix the problems of tax competition, of the race to the bottom, even without the cooperation of tax havens. So we should not wait for the tax havens to change. We, Germany, France, the countries that want to move forward, we can change things on our own. How do we change things? We start collecting the tax deficit of multinational firms. So of course, international cooperation is always better, but I think it's not enough to just point fingers at other countries and saying they need to change, they need to stop what they're doing. We can get our acts together, tax our own multinationals, collect 100% of their tax deficit, and then collect part of the tax deficit of foreign companies. We can do that now.
Yeah, I would only like to confront you directly again with the question which was asked on the developing countries. So if you move to the source taxation logic, where everybody takes their perceived legitimate share, how do you make sure that also smaller countries, which may be more attacked by investors claiming, if you also join this nasty policy, we will not go. We will go to the next free port for our next international inward investment. How do you make sure that also small countries dare to join?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't pretend that I have a perfect answer to that question. Frankly, I think that each country's circumstances are different, and that some countries can have different tax policy, different ways to compute profits, use different allocation formulas to apportion the tax deficit. It's not the case that we need to apply the exact same system in each country. I think there is it's possible to have a diversity of policies. For instance, in the US, each US state has a corporate tax, and it's not exactly the same definition of profits. There is some heterogeneity, and it works relatively well. Short answer is, I don't think there is necessarily a one-size-fits-all policy that should be implemented in each country, including developing countries. And I don't have, a ready-made solution for each developing country. It depends on their particular circumstances.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gabriel. Thank you very much, Catherine. I enjoyed this discussion very much. I have to say, the clarity of your proposal and the underlying data is very important for the future debate on tax justice. I also welcome very strongly your initiative of INCRIT, the Independent Commission for the Reform of the Corporate Taxation System, where also our much missed former colleague Eva Joly is a member, as you are, Gabriel. I would like to say from my perspective that there's no doubt we cannot tolerate any longer that member states are blocking any progress. And we have seen some progress, as Catherine has said, mainly in the areas where we had the threat of either unilateral action, as we have seen it with the automatic information exchange for banks, as well as in the area of anti-money laundering, where we have majority voting rules in the European Union. And I'm very optimistic that we will see more progress, in particular in the fight against money laundering and financial crime, because the Commission will, after our long pressure and many scandals, come out with strong proposals supported now by a cross-party majority in the European Parliament, which was a long process to get there, and also supported by many member states. So therefore, I'm optimistic that we will see progress. When it comes to corporate taxation, The situation is much more messy. We are still lacking the support of a qualified majority for the tax transparency rules, where I have just been today with the Ministry of Economics in Germany. I'm just now in Berlin, and asked them, why don't you support? Why do you provide with your stupid abstention the majority for the tax havens to block? And I have to report back and to say they are as stubborn as Germans can be. So I can't give all the details, but they are still determined, the CDU side of the government, to block any reform on tax transparency. This shows how important it is to also discuss the potential sticks we have in order to get out of the deadlock. And I have to say that still, I believe that in Europe, a coordinated approach would be best, also with a view of the global debate. So we have to give now, until the end of the year, the global discussions in the OECD around the minimum tax rate plus progress in corporate taxation a chance. But it's also, from a German perspective, for me, totally ununderstandable that we leave the dirty work to the French by threatening with a digital tax, having the debates with Trump, which is certainly not funny, leaving that to Macron, while the Germans are basically saying, we are the nice ones with the Americans, we care about our interests in the trade field, while the French, they can spoil their reputation with the Americans. I find that a really unsatisfactory approach to French-German cooperation. Having said that, I'm not a fan of Macron's policies generally on many fronts in France, but when it came to digital taxation, clearly France was a leader, and Germany has let France down when it came to negotiating with the Americans and also supporting the proposals of the European Commission. When it comes now to Gabriel's suggestion, I think this is a perfect stick which one has to consider using once we cannot get anywhere when it comes to minimum taxation and the common corporate tax base in Europe. I would not say that we are still in the same world as in the 1990s. Gabriel is right, the history of that debate is very long. But what we have seen is that and now the Commission has put a fully fledged legislative proposal on the table. The European Parliament has voted it with some modifications, and the member states can't agree. And then now the question is, will the member states which do not want to accept this drain any longer, will they join forces with an alternative proposal with a more limited number of countries? And there either we agree on minimum tax rates and a common consolidated tax base in combination, or even some member states have to go to the more far-reaching approaches as Gabriel is suggesting them. In the end, where we fully agree, the time is over to wait any longer. So we cannot accept any longer that a number of member states are spoiling the reputation of the European integration project, of the common market, and as Gabriel has put it, of globalization as a whole, by making that a place for tax dodging and taking member states away opportunities to limit inequalities. Inequalities are toxic for democracy, they are toxic for Europe, and at least Greens believe in Europe. We shouldn't tolerate that any longer. And lastly, I have to send apologies to Tascha, because she is, of course, not from my constituency of Düsseldorf, but from Troisdorf. And we have also our local conflicts in the Rhineland. So please apologies to Troisdorf about this. And thanks for your work helping us organizing that. Everyone who wants to get all the details, Please watch the video online. It will be put online very soon. You get an email with the link, so be happy. We are pleased if you spread it. And most importantly, don't hesitate to buy Gabriel's book, because it's worth reading. Thank you to all. Bye-bye. Thanks to Gabriel. Thanks to Catherine. We keep up the fight for tax justice in Europe. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.